we want to put everything into a bucket, into a file. We want to be able to come across something, understand what it is. This is an orange. It goes in the bucket of how I interact with oranges, and I'm fine. When you come across a person who you look at your buckets and you're like, oh, well, I don't know how to interact with them because I don't know where they fit.
Welcome to The Race to Social Justice, a podcast that explores the myriad racial and social challenges facing the modern world, with your hosts, Kiva White and John Kepner. Thank you for being part of the courageous conversation, because when it comes to combating social injustices in America, it is not about being confrontational. It is about being conversational.
Good evening, John.
Hey, Kiva, how you doing?
I'm doing well this evening. Good to see you as always. Welcome everyone to the Race to Social Justice podcast series. I'm Kiva White. As you can see, I'm the black guy. I've been this way for a very long time, and I don't think I'm going to change anytime soon.
I always get a laugh out of that. You say that every time.
Yeah.
And I'm John Kepner, the white guy. Kiva and I share a love of the letter K, our common initial. K for Kiva, K for Kepner. But more importantly, our thirst for K knowledge, what Kiva calls the K factor. So Kiva, who's our guest tonight?
Well, John, I have the wonderful pleasure to introduce to our listeners today and to you as well, Clinton Drees. Clinton is an educator and advocate for the LGBTQ plus community, especially as it relates to youth who are members of this community. Clinton is one of our senior training consultants at VIP Community Services and conducts professional development training sessions for our clients in the school setting, in healthcare arena, nonprofit social service agencies, and really focusing on best practice models for engaging staff and service recipients who identify as LGBTQT. So welcome, Clinton. I have met Clinton several years ago while conducting a presentation for Big Brothers and Big Sisters of Philadelphia, and his passion really resonated towards racial justice. That was evident during our post-training conversation. You know, John, just like you and me, our relationship has evolved over the years, and similar to that, Clinton and I have remained friends ever since our initial encounter, which was about 3 years ago. And I often call upon him when I find myself stumped around how to address gender and sexuality specific issues. An example, Clinton provided consultation surrounding the appropriate use of language to utilize on a DEI survey project that I was working on to make sure that we're gathering the right information from those participants. So Clinton, it's good to see you. It's good to have you on the show. Thank you so much for your willingness to join us today.
Absolutely. Happy to be here. A little familiar with what y'all have been doing and think that it's great and wanted to support if I could.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And so, this is a conversation, and, we're gonna learn from you, and our listeners will learn from you as well. And please feel free to ask us questions, because that's what conversations is reciprocal in terms of, this dialogue that we're going to jump into. So let's just jump right in. So I recall a while ago, in our initial discussions around your lived experiences as a gay white male. Can you share a little bit about how, your social identities influence whether you experience oppression or privilege in our society? What has it been like for you as a member of the LGBTQ community? And am I saying that? Do I have the letters correct? Because I always mix that up.
I always
you have all the letters in there. Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay, I just wanted to make sure. Okay, good. Go.
So that's always an interesting question, because I find myself sort of on the fence. On one hand, I am white and male, which is not a surprise to most of us in this country, affords me certain privileges. And then on the other side of the balancing act is being a sexual minority, identify as gay and or queer. We'll talk a little bit about language there in a minute. And then also being somebody who is neurodivergent. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that terminology. Examples of people who are not, it's a umbrella term. So people on spectrum, people with, bipolar disorder, these sorts of things are neurodivergent. They are not neurotypical. There are ways in which the brain has developed and functions that are different. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, some of my privilege is very presentable and passing. I'm, similar to Kiva, I'm probably never changing colors in my life, at least not drastically, to the point that people are putting me into a different bucket. In terms of, being male, I am somebody who presents as male, how I dress, the fact that I can grow facial hair and wear it, I don't get misgendered very often. So it's interesting because there are some ways that I have access to privilege, very much so. And then there are other ways in which I am, a minority and have dealt with various forms of oppression in my life. And being white and male also affords me sometimes physical access. So like being in the locker room or being in the break room when only male employees are in there. Sometimes things are said, not knowing who I am, not knowing what I'm about, and sort of under the assumption that, it's okay to say something really crappy and terrible about people right now because it's in this enclosed space. So there's a vantage point that I've had in my life of being in a room where people are talking about people like me, but they don't know that I'm part of that group. So there's been different vantage points throughout it. I definitely recognize that with the privilege of some of my demographics that I have had access and I have not faced the sort of oppression and different forms of bigotry that some of my friends and chosen family have faced, because they might be a gender minority, they might be a person of color who's also queer. And so it's been interesting to look at over the years.
It's interesting how I'm glad you mentioned that about the privilege part of being male and being, a white male, and that, this whole concept of race talk. And that's what I'm assuming that you have experience in addition to talking about, when you're in a group and you hear people talking about people who are gay, and that you have the vantage point of actually folks not recognizing that you're gay. So I wanted to talk about like what does and I'm not trying to be disparaging or anything, but what does gay look like? Like what? Because like you said, they don't know you're gay. So how would you recognize that? Because I have had several encounters where I just misgendered someone because I just really didn't know. I didn't know. Mm-hmm. And for example, I would see somebody and they look male gendered, and then I would say, sir, or have a good day, sir, and then I would get this backlash for doing that. So mm-hmm. Two-part question. What does that look like? What does it look like? And then if somebody, what advice would you give to avoid misgendering someone?
So my answer is in three parts.
Nice.
The first one is, and something that I think is going to be really important for the audience.
Yeah.
We say the LGBTQ community, but it's not a singular community. And this is an oversight for various minorities in our society, whether they are sexual, gender, ethnic, national, or racial.
Yeah.
So similarly, Kiva can't speak for all Black people, all people of color.
That's right.
We know that, and that would be at least for me, I would feel that would be terribly insulting if I went to Kiva and I said, "Hey, explain this thing that I don't understand," with authority across the board. So we're not one singular community, and we are certainly not homogenous. We are many communities. We are spread across many communities that outside of our sexual and gender demographics. And, the question of what gay looks like, Keith, I don't know if you remember during that training, what got us talking was you had asked a question about stereotypes. Yep. And my response was, what's an example of, people using stereotypes? And I chimed in, gaydar. This is not a term that Kiva had heard before.
Gaydar, yeah.
But the idea that gaydar, gay radar, that you can tell somebody is gay. I will tell you flat out, you cannot. There's correlations that you may see in different kinds of body language. There's a great documentary, I think, on Hulu, Do I Sound Gay? So the language that you use, the tone that you use. I'm using my natural speaking voice right now, but if I found myself in a situation where I didn't feel safe or if that was homophobic, if I need to, I can drop my voice a good bit, make sure that my wrists are really locked in, no limp wrist over here. There are ways
Wow.
that I can pass and sort of protect myself in those situations. I have met individuals who are CEOs, professional athletes, to hairdressers and full-time drag performers. There's no one sort of term for what gay looks like. And even going traveling in Europe and Eastern Asia for work, traveling throughout the US in my journeys, it's really wide and broad. So that's one thing that I always want people to be cognizant of. Like, it's not something that I'm going to say, oh, stop right there, because you can't use the word community. But we are far more diverse and complex. So what does gay look like? It looks like everything, If I don't know, other than the fact that John referenced his partner, and I think he used female pronouns, I don't know if John, was. I've met your partner, and who was lovely, Kiva. But from looks, any one of us could be,
It's interesting. You use the word partner. I was talking to someone the other day that I was just meeting, and he mentioned his partner, and I automatically assumed right away that he was gay until later on in the conversation, he mentioned her.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, that's something new in my experience, because previously I didn't hear people refer to their heterosexual partners as partners. So that's something that's changed a bit, at least in my experience.
Well, even within that example, you might have a male and female couple, but both of them could be, one could be bisexual and one could be pansexual.
Sure.
So it could still be a queer relationship and could be part of the queer community, but may not present that way. So, thinking that somebody's deal just by glancing at them and who they're around is always going to be problematic, Now, as biological entities, we do that. We're constantly making judgments, looking down an alleyway. Is it safe to go through? You make a snap judgment that's pulled from different parts. But if we're sitting and thinking and really trying to dig into it, that's where you got to push past for yourself. And then just with a little bit about language, I do use the term partner as a generic umbrella term for couples, or not even that it has to be two. I have friends who are polyamorous. So they have multiple partners within their committed relationship. Kiva had mentioned about, saying, good day, sir, or thank you, ma'am, something like that. I really, in this work, one of the big takeaways is I try really hard to scrub out gender assumptions from my interactions. So, I was born in Virginia. We moved around a bit, but y'all has somehow stuck in my vocabulary throughout the years. Y'all, folks. Sometimes I'll do that, especially if I'm addressing a queer audience and spell it FOLX. Just thinking about, is the gendered language that we're using necessary, appropriate, helpful? If you walked into a business scenario nowadays and called everybody you thought was male sport and everybody you thought was female sweetheart, we see how language evolves and changes, and understanding sexism in the workplace and how those monikers aren't really appropriate. I think that in my journey through this and learning more about sexual and gender minorities in our society and culture and how they function and live, Wherever I can take out assumptions of gender, wherever I can take out gendered language, I try to at this point. Now, some people are going to push back on that and say, "Oh, well, I've been saying it this way forever." But
that's what I was gonna say that like, I think it's a paradigm shift of thinking, and it just really it comes for me. The term cultural humility really lends to making this transition, because it's hard. Sometimes I slip up. So I've been trying very hard to consciously and cognitively be mindful that I may not know. So you know what my two words are now? My friend. That's because I'm trying. And so notice, Clinton, I always say I call you because my friend, right? I say, thank you. Hey, my friend, how are you? And I'm really trying to do that in public too, because I'm just trying to create, one, a harmonious interaction with the person, and two, being mindful that because I have had a couple of misjudgments on, because I didn't know, because the person presented as male, right? Facial hair, bandana, the whole thing, but the person was not male. And they let me know emphatically. And so I've learned from experiences like that, and also, being your friend for over the years, is that it's best to just try as best as possible to stay neutral and use like neutral terms. And so mine is, when I'm done, thank you, my friend. I pay my money, and I just say, thank you, my friend. Appreciate that. So
I like that.
I want to pick up on something a little divergent, but only a little divergent. Did I hear you just use the word cultural humility, Kiva?
Yes.
Okay. So I just read that word yesterday for the first time.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And it was in the context of working with a diversity officer at a university that I'm involved with, who was helping me with a grant that I'm working on. And she sent me back some revisions to the grant, and she used the word cultural humility, and I had to look it up. Many of our listeners may not know what that is. So could you just take a second and talk about that? And then we'll get back to Clinton. I just think it's a good learning opportunity.
Yeah, I think there's all kinds of definitions out there to describe what cultural humility is. But my basic definition is really the humble willingness to learn and acknowledge and to engage with difference. That's all. It's a humble willingness, a position of vulnerability to say internally, I really don't know. So let me humble myself. Let me open myself up. Number one, to learn, to get information, to be educated, because I think that's what I really appreciate about my relationship with Clinton, because I get even now I'm learning about, but every time we talk, and I'm really opening myself up to be vulnerable, to learn about his lived experiences. And so I think cultural humility is when you want to learn something about a different culture that's not that of yours, you need to humble yourself, and it needs to be an authentic willingness to drop all that you know and all the social narratives that you have heard in society about whatever the group may be. It may be about African Americans. It may be about the Latino or Hispanic population. My wife always gets my wife's from Guatemala, but everybody automatically assumes that she's Mexican. And so that's an erroneous social narrative or stereotype. And so we know what the social narrative is today about Mexicans, unfortunately, because of the last admit. So I don't want her to be, facing any discrimination from what's been said, unfortunately. But that's what cultural humility is. It's really asking questions, engaging with people in an authentic way, with the end product of learning something new about a culture that you really don't know about.
Thank you. So picking up on that, Clinton, I'd like to hear about your early years when you realized that you were gay, and how that played out with your family.
Oh boy. Well, stop me when I have gone on too many tangents. But I get asked the question from time to time, when did you know? And it's always an interesting question, because my first response is, well, on what level are we talking? Because internally, between myself at an awareness level, middle school, probably as early as 5th or 6th grade, when everybody was, getting girlfriends, and I had girlfriends in middle school. I got candy and presents for one of my female friends, and we got to like hang out. Like, it was fairly innocent at the time. On some level, I knew that I was attracted to men. In high school, and this is not an uncommon experience. Once again, I can't speak for everybody, and I certainly don't want to insult the population I'm about to talk about. But in terms of my development, I had figured out, growing up in a conservative Catholic household, large family, I think at 17, I'd figured out that I liked boys. And so at that point in time, I thought that I was bisexual. And I was like, okay, cool. Girls are fine. I'm giving myself permission to like boys. And then it probably wasn't until I got to college when I sort of realized, oh, I like boys and I don't like girls. So the, settling onto the identity of gay was in different pieces for me. It wasn't an aha moment. I have friends who knew as young as maybe 3rd grade. I'm thinking of one close friend in particular who, and had very supportive parents and was in California in a pretty liberal environment. So he knew as early as 3rd grade, and the discrimination and oppression that he's faced in his life is very different than mine. We both happen to be white gay men. And if you added a third person who's, somebody who's LGBTQ and a person of color into the mix, we're all going to have 3 very different experiences and processes. But I think for me, it took me longer because I was in a conservative religious environment. I did 9 years of Catholic schooling. So I heard everything from explicitly being told I was going to go to hell for being gay to, my high school was an all-boys Catholic high school. And just one of the worst places you could have put a closeted gay kid. I mean, you go into one of the most homophobic environments because everybody at that school, regardless of identity, doesn't want to be mistaken as gay. But you're at an all-boys high school, which is atypical for our location and time. So it really created one of the most explicitly homophobic. You couldn't change classes without hearing the word faggot. Really? I don't think any time. Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow.
And I'd say maybe only 30% of the faculty would interrupt if they heard gay slurs in their class. There'd be some times where, somebody would say, oh, that's inappropriate. But by and large, it was fine to belittle other people. At that time in high school, I was in the closet. And so, as long as I didn't get too much attention and sort of, figured out how to keep everybody happy, I was okay. One of my classmates who was a year ahead of me, he did not have some of the passing privilege that I have. He's somebody who people look at and they assume he is because he is flamboyant in his vocal tones, his gestures, his language, what he talks about. And he had, I honestly don't know why he graduated from there because he was a year ahead of me. But the things that I heard and saw, books getting knocked out, shoved into lockers, and with very little support or reaction from the school. So that was an interesting leg of my life. And then going to a liberal arts college and, finding so many people who, I think the first person in college I came out to was a friend and I told, and she was a great ally. She met me with that, when I was vulnerable and opening up to her, she met me with affirmation, thank you for telling me, I feel so honored. What can I do to be a better friend? That willingness to learn, practicing a little bit of cultural humility there. And then she just asked, is this something that's well known? Is this something you want me to keep in confidence? And that was a really great response. That sort of looking only a few years before, and this is when I had sort of figured I thought that I was bisexual. Part of the way that I survived high school was I got very involved in service, and being in a Catholic high school, there was a campus ministry department. Like, I ate my lunches there, so I didn't have to deal with the horrors of the cafeteria in all boys Catholic high school. I was literally telling a very close friend of mine that I thought I liked boys. We had done a lot of stuff in campus ministry together. We were very close friends. And I'm literally sitting in a closet on the corded phone, trying to come out to a friend of mine. And her response was, I'm ashamed. I'm so disappointed in you. How can you let this happen? So as I'm physically in the closet trying to come out, she's like pushing me back in. So it's, and I feel like I've ran a little bit of a tangent here.
Well, how did it,
but some of those, there's some highlights, I guess.
I can see the progression of your coming out. How did it affect your choices? Did it affect where you went to college? Did you actively look for other men who were gay or who you thought were gay? And go back to my original question, what about your family?
Yeah. So big family, conservative family, both religious and politically. Growing up, and one element of it was growing up, the only time I had heard about a gay individual was a friend of my parents. My parents are high school sweethearts. And in college, they had a friend who was gay who took his own life, sadly. And that was the only example of a real life gay person, not somebody on TV, not somebody in the community, but somebody my parents knew. Coming out to them, there was a lot of, it was really difficult at the time. Communication was really challenging. I didn't have the language that I have developed over the years. They certainly didn't have the language framework understanding. Like I said, my parents' only experience with, somebody who died by suicide because of their sexual identity. So there was, it was challenging. And for a couple of years, it was pretty rough because I wasn't sure of where certain members of my family stood in terms of were they supportive, were they not. I had at that time I didn't come out to my family until 19. And at that point in time, I was trying to come out to them. But before I did that, for me, I had to get into a mental place where if they pulled my tuition, I had a plan. Before I came out to my parents. Really? Huh. Yeah, wow. And my parents were very supportive, and they've come a long way in their learning and language. But yeah, before I came out, I had a plan that I would drop out. I would continue this job on campus. I would move into this housing. I would go to this community satellite school for a couple of years and then get back in and graduate from my alma mater. That is a reality for a lot of individuals. And when you look at some of the research around it, percentage of the population that's LGBTQ is challenging. How you measure something that people may not know about themselves is challenging. But I usually say 10% of the population is LGBTQ. When you look at the population rates for homeless youth, 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ. There are differences in the realities lived for young queer people, considerations, and they might have parents who end up being allies in the end. They may have parents who are allies, but don't know how to communicate that, don't know, the language and whatnot. But it is, it's a big thing to come out. And for, anybody listening to this, I guarantee you know somebody who is LGBTQ. Whether they know it or not, whether you know it or not, there's just, unless you are a hermit, there's somebody in your life that you've come across.
Oh, sure.
who is.
Yeah. Can I ask you? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I wanted to ask you because I think it's going back to what I said about what does gay look like. So you answered that, and then you just used the word queer, and so help us understand, and those who are listening, what does a queer person look like? Because you see somebody with purple hair, they may have the ring, the tattoos, and the plate earrings, the big,
The gauge, yeah.
what's it called?
They're called gauged ears.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
ears. And so when you see somebody like that, so some people say that's different. Like when I see it, I'll say that's different. I can't really put a label on it. I'll say
Yeah.
that's different. But would that be an example of someone who's queer? So it's two part. And then does a person that is queer, does that necessarily mean that they're also gay?
So queer is a term, and there are other examples in our nation's history. It's a very charged word, and for a long time was strictly pejorative. 20 years ago, if I heard the word queer, I would assume that it was used in a hateful, manner. That word has been, and I'm not a queer historian, but that word has been reclaimed, and it's a word that can mean different things depending on who you're talking to. For me, I use it as sort of a nebulous umbrella term. So for me, I identify as queer. That has to do more with my sexuality. I have friends who identify as queer, and it has more to do with their gender. And I have some friends who identify as queer, and it's both their sexuality and gender. The example you gave about, somebody with purple hair and gauged ears and whatnot, that might be something that somebody thinks like, oh, I wonder if they are, because they seem so different from me and how they dress or express. But you really can't tell based on that, Right. They could be walking side by side, somebody in a 3-piece suit, and that person is, straight as an arrow, which I don't even really know what that phrase means, but,
Right.
And the other person could be, in a long-term committed gay relationship.
Yep.
So, once again, the look like is always going to be a little fraught. There's no one mascot or spokesperson. You can even look at people. You can look at people who are trans, and somebody who is, like Caitlyn Jenner, who has a lot of resources and has had a lot of privileges in her life, and her transition journey looks very different than somebody who's a person of color, from living in poverty, trauma in their background. Their transition is going to look very different. I use the example Caitlyn Jenner not because I think that they're necessarily a excellent role model or anything, but just because they're more of a popular example. I actually have a lot of issues with her politics, but that's a separate thing.
Follow-up question. LGBTQ.
Thank you for that.
Is Q different from LGBT, or
so
is there a crossover?
This is where we get into what I call alphabet soup.
Yeah. I mean, it's confusing to a lot of people that casually.
And it goes back to the way that our brains work. We want to put everything into a bucket, into a file. We want to be able to come across something, understand what it is. This is an orange. It goes in the bucket of how I interact with oranges, and I'm fine. When you come across a person who you look at your buckets and you're like, oh, well, I don't know how to interact with them because I don't know where they fit, is where you see a lot of people stumbling over stuff. But LGBT, so you could say LGBT, you could say LGBTQ, you could say LGBTQIA, GNC. There's lots of letters that can go into it. But at its whole, it's really an umbrella term for sexual and gender minorities in our society. For people who may not be familiar, L is for lesbians, G, gay, B, bisexual, T, trans. LGBT has been around for a long time. I like using LGBTQ plus. Queer is another. I've talked a little bit about that word. And then plus is because there's other identities out there.
Yeah.
There's the Queertionary, which is a dictionary of queer terms, and it's printed out. I think it's like an 18-page document.
What's it called?
And
The queertionary. It's like a dictionary.
Queertionary.
Yeah.
Is it oh wow, okay. Like of terms.
I'm not sure. I know I've come across it in a few trainings. I'm not sure if it's a private or a public resource. But I can at least look that up for you.
Yeah, that would be great.
If not, I have a copy of it. I can always send over. I'm not sure if I lost the question though. Oh yeah. Q. Q can mean a lot of things. And GNC, you might see gender non-conforming. Sometimes you'll see I with LGBTQIAA. The I is for intersex. And then the last two A's can be people who are asexual or people who are aromantic.
Cisgender. Wow, I see that a lot.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Yeah. Cisgender, Clinton. Mm-hmm. What cisgender? What's that? CIS. I see that a lot. Cisgender.
Yeah. So when a person is born in our society, a determination is made about their biological sex. I put that in quotation marks because really what's happening is either during a sonogram or at birth, a medical professional is looking at the perceivable genitalia and making an assessment on if this person is male or female.
Right.
So we have this idea that's a little fraught that everybody's either male or female. We know that there are people who are intersex. They're about the same rate as natural redheads in our country, around 2%. People who are born intersex may have, hormones, genitalia from both of these sexes. And so I don't like starting on a false dichotomy if there's only male and female. Past that, so that sex and then presumed gender identity, I see a penis, so you must be a boy, and you will be masculine in your gender and how you express your gender to the world around you, how you talk, how you act, the activities you do, what you wear. Cisgender means it's the Latin, I think it's a Latin prefix meaning the same. And so cisgender just means the determination that was made in the delivery room or wherever you were brought into this world, and that determination was made, lines up and is the same as how you identify in terms of your gender now. So I was born a boy. I was born and somebody said I was a boy, and that has not been an issue for me. I am cisgender. My gender identity has been the same. The opposite of that would then be transgender, trans for change. And I forget if that's Greek or Latin, but transgender just means that what somebody thought you were in terms of your gender identity, your gender identity over time has changed from what was originally dictated to you.
Okay, that was helpful because I see a lot of people say I'm a white female who identifies as cisgender. But what you just described is if you say you're a white female, shouldn't it end there? Why does it have to be a follow-up who identifies as cis? That's where the confusing part for me comes sometimes. I'm a white female who identify as cisgender.
Yeah, because it could be a white transgender individual. So I think when people use cisgender, a lot of times people are, I think in an attempt, or at least hopefully an attempt for cultural humility, people are recognizing their privilege. So, if you have somebody say, I'm cisgender, and, I usually that's probably going to tie back into some way of their privilege. That is not necessarily, if you met, somebody like Laverne Cox, who is, a very famous trans woman of color. If you saw her strutting down the street, you wouldn't know who she is. If you met her and started talking about things, you wouldn't know what her backstory is. But there are ways in which that she has faced privilege, or that she has some passing privilege currently. But there are ways in which that, you may not think that looking at her and her gender identity, that is a source of, discrimination or problems for her.
John, you know who Laverne Cox is?
Yeah, I think I do. Yeah.
I know RuPaul. I call it like the modern day RuPaul for me.
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
I think about her.
Yeah.
Is there a gay male figure public figure who you believe is a good spokesman and a good role model for other gay men?
Are you? I know many wonderful gay role models, queer role models, mentors. Are you asking for somebody that anybody would be able to recognize?
Yes,
Like,
a public figure. Yeah.
Public figure, yeah.
That is a good question. I don't know that there's like a model gay out there or a model queer person. Everybody's life is different, and what it means for me to live my life well is going to be different, from anybody else to varying degrees. So, I don't know that there's one person who I look to and I'm like, oh yeah, they have it figured out. They're perfect. Like, give them a microphone, they can speak for me. There are a lot of people along the way. Persons like Billy Porter is somebody who I really respect. Neil Patrick Harris would be somebody else who, from what I've heard, and I don't know these people, interpersonally, but two examples of celebrities, public figures who, when I hear them talk about stuff for LGBTQ plus individuals and as sort of ambassadors that you have to be at that stage, those are two individuals that come to mind. Elliot Page, somebody who I've known their acting roles for a number of years. And for those who aren't familiar, Elliot Page is a trans actor. I'm not going to use their name that you might be more familiar with. That's something called dead naming. And when somebody who is in their gender journey, whether it's they're trans, queer, non-binary, at some point in time, individuals feel that their name that was given to them doesn't match up with who they are. So there's a term called dead naming, which is using an individual's dead name. So if you think about if you are a trans person and you go to renew your license, there might be a number of microaggressions that occur in that, because if you haven't done a legal name change, you might identify as male, present as masculine, but your name on the driver's license and the paperwork is still Mary. So there's all sorts of challenges that come with that, and states are a lot better. I haven't checked in a while. I think we're over a third of states that now offer a third gender marker on driver's licenses for individuals. But
wow.
Yeah. And once again, I'm not sure. I started.
No, that was good.
So the reason I mentioned that ties a bit to another question I want to ask you about advocacy in the area, because sometimes public figures are spokespeople. They're advocates. I was thinking, when I asked the question, I was thinking more a model for a young person coming up and figuring out their sexuality and discovering they're gay, and they have public role models to look to for indirect support for this. But on a macro basis, they could be assisting in advocacy. Now, you're an advocate, obviously, to me, just from your knowledge and the education you've already given us today. You're advocating, but could you talk a little bit about how you feel about advocacy in this area? I'm really interested in your thoughts about. It seemed to me that there was a dramatic shift when the gay marriage controversy was in, and suddenly, now there is gay marriage. It wasn't exactly suddenly, but it was quicker than I think a lot of people expected it. There was a lot of advocacy around that. Could you speak to that issue a little bit?
So in terms of advocacy, you know, I think some individuals, like I can be an advocate in the, in fighting racism. That's fine. As a white person, I would argue that I even have a moral obligation to do so. One thought that comes to mind in advocacy is you have people who, whether it is, close personal thing or it's a new pet project, people want to get in there, get involved. And you can have diversity. You don't have to, your LGBTQ initiative doesn't have to only be staffed by LGBTQ individuals. But, just like if I was talking on sexism or racism, I would be really cognizant as a white male of how much airtime I take up. If I'm asked to, so there's times, actually, I think Kiva just asked me a question for a training. And I was like, you know what? I could do that training, and I could do a good job with it. But I think a trans person is just going to have a tighter insight, a deeper understanding. And the issue is really the ask behind the training was really about trans bullying. And I just felt like, that really feels like something that one of my trans colleagues who does training should speak to, as opposed to speaking for them in that respect. I can talk about racism, but if it's just a bunch of white people in the room talking about racism, are we solving anything? Are we doing anything? Are we engaging? There's some times where that is the right call, because we got to do our work and we don't want to put that onerous on others. Also within advocacy, and for people who are listening and have a willingness to learn and grow, it doesn't feel great to be reduced to one component of your identity, regardless of that, of what that means. And so there is, in doing this work professionally, part of the reason I continue to do this work with Kiva is because I don't feel it with him, but I've had other contexts where I felt incredibly tokenized, where, and I certainly hope that it wasn't the case, but what it felt like to me was just like, oh, the gay guy will take care of that,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So in advocacy, being careful, not to speak for, being cognizant of airways and letting people who have experienced it firsthand share their stories. And then, tokenizing, I don't want anybody walking away from this conversation thinking that I have all the answers. I cannot speak for, I can barely even speak for gay men at this point, let alone the varying levels of diversity and intersectionality when we start looking at individuals under this umbrella term. And I had another thought, it'll come back to me in a minute, but it's a great question around advocacy. It's so important and critical to do the work, but you really have to practice cultural humility. I might travel to a foreign country and I might want to maybe get a job there and support, their economy in a way. But I have to do that in recognizing and understanding that, I'm coming into a foreign context. There are other people who have, done this work, who have systems of meaning behind what they do. And so, I think anybody who is speaking on behalf of the LGBTQ community has to be very careful and cognizant of who they are and how they relate to that umbrella term.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wow. I think what you shared earlier about parenting, and I wanted to go back to that for 1 second, because you said your parents, it took a while for them, paraphrasing, you said it took a while for your parents to come to terms with who you are and where you are in life. And I wanted to know, did you have what advice or what would you suggest to parents who might have just been informed, like tonight, there's somebody coming out tonight on this very day and telling their parents, that they're gay, or that they're, bisexual, or that they're queer, that they want to, change their sex, they want to go, transgender, and it's happening at this very moment. and you get that call as an advocate, what advice would you give to that parent?
First and most important is that is an incredibly vulnerable act to come out to a parent. And I have friends who have come out to one of my friends. I shouldn't laugh because most of the story is actually quite sad. But at 45, came out to his 70-year-old mother who would only live another year, if I remember the timeline correctly. Regardless of when it's happening, whether they're small, big, old, coming out is a vulnerable experience, especially for coming out to somebody like a parent where there is such a big power differential. If you are a teacher and you have a student coming out to you, that's a really big deal because you're a teacher and you have a lot more power and authority within the scholastic context than the student does. So first, this is recognized as a big deal. And I'm a big fan of, I don't want to make things too complicated. So I always go for offer a nice sandwich. You start with something nice, the bread. Kiva, thank you so much for trusting me, feeling like you would talk to me. I'm really honored and floored that you opened up to me about that. Thank you so much. The meat of that can be whatever it needs to be. So for some parents, it may be, I don't understand any of this. I need a crash course, It might happen because somebody's coming out because the child has just had their heart broken. They might be coming out to you because they're being bullied. So the meat may be very different. You need to respond to that appropriately. But making sure that you end that conversation as well with another nice thing. Hey, once again, I just want you to know, I understand this is important. I'm gonna take my cues from you. You're in charge. I will not talk about this until you say it's okay to. Figure out some way to start with affirmation and support and end with affirmation and support. Because the stuff in the middle is important, but it is the first thing. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Understand.
Is the first thing that is said that will be heard and remembered over the years. And I'm getting a little choked up thinking of some of the less pleasant responses that I got over the years to that.
Well, and that's the reason why I asked that, because we talked about in previous shows racial trauma, right? And how certain acts of race towards African Americans, any marginalized group, can be traumatizing, whether it's Native Americans, whether it's Mexicans coming over the border, any marginalized group. There's this racial trauma that people need to understand that happens as a result of these power dynamics that exist in society. And I could see you getting choked up in this conversation, because I would only imagine that you're reflecting back to a situation where you felt kind of disenfranchised internally. And I call that silent trauma. And I think the silence of trauma, like enduring it, for somebody to hold on to something that they really need to share, but they're afraid to say something about it because they're afraid of the response that they will get. I can only imagine the internal struggle, so to speak, that must feel like. I can only empathize with that just from my own experience with racial profiling. When I grew up in New York City as a 17-year-old, I still can recall some of those, not so good encounters. I even have a scar over, I think it's this eye, from when I was backhanded from a police officer for just running around in a school on Columbus Day, where some kids broke into my junior high school, and there was, mischief kids. I was about 11 or 12 years old and playing tag in a high school, and the neighbor called the police, and the police came in, to round up all the kids, and I was backhanded. And so I think about like the overt traumatic experiences from racism and what we call racial trauma. But I wanted to see what you share a little bit about, if you're okay with that, like the silent trauma what I call the silent trauma phenomenon, or that piece that I can only imagine you holding, people holding something in that they really need to share, but I don't want to share because I'm afraid of what the response is going to be.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up the T word. I think a lot of my work has really transformed in studying and understanding trauma. I think I've really changed in my own understanding, studying a little bit about trauma. As you started that, you kind of, I'm not sure if it was your intent, you sort of painted it as, somebody's coming out and being aware of trauma and their background. I just want to say real quick, LGBTQ youth are far more likely to experience trauma based on their sexual and or gender identities alone. LGBTQ kids are twice as likely to be bullied online, 3 times as likely to be forced into having sex, 5 times as likely to use illegal substances compared to their straight and cis peers before they graduate from high school. All 3 of those stats are from a federal, I think it was a 2017 federal study on high school sexual identity and behavior.
Wow.
I always like to be able to cite when I pull out that.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
But so with that, my thought was just to share with people trauma, and there's a really great book, The Body Keeps Score. I forget the author's name, but if you want to study this, that's a great starter for it. But trauma impacts our language center. So you sort of think about like after a fire or something, emergency services are there, and there's victims who have blankets wrapped around them and can't really talk. Trauma impacts your language center. So it can be really difficult. The example we were talking about coming out, your kid may only have gotten so far as figuring out that they need to get that one sentence out of their mouth, and they don't, because they are dealing with trauma. They may not have, sort of an academic understanding of their gender and sexuality. They may not be ready for anything past that. It's just one sort of caveat to look out for. I think a little bit of what you were working into was asking about sort of my trauma with being a sexual minority. Is that right?
Yeah. So see, I'm comparing racial trauma to the trauma that a sexual minority would encounter, and I'm calling that silent trauma because most people, like you just described, can't find the words to say, and they hold that in, and I can just only imagine what that must feel like.
Yeah. So, in my life, some of my traumas were around bullying, and that was mostly in middle school. And I don't know if I was bullied because I was gay. I was probably just bullied because I was different. But the fact that I was gay and the language that they used really, that was why I was in the closet in high school, was because of those experiences. All of a sudden touch football at recess became, was it Spear the Queer? Where it's just like, all right, this isn't football. We're targeting somebody and we're all going to pile on top of them, that kind of stuff. I'll share an example. It actually wasn't traumatic, but I think it's an example of something people experience. I have a lot of friends who have had issues, even living in Philadelphia, where we have a lot more LGBTQ services. Part of the mayor's office is dedicated. There's the LGBT affairs for the city of Philadelphia. We have resources, personnel assigned to protect us. I've had a number of friends who, just walking through the neighborhood, meeting friends for a drink, going out to dinner, have had anything from slurs thrown out at them to one of my friends was hit over the back of the head with a beer bottle that was thrown out of a moving car with some ugly language that came with it. I had an experience a couple of years ago. I am in a LGBTQ sports league and play, I think I was playing kickball at the time. And, I bike down, and it's a gay sports league, so there are some short shorts. There's a lot of very fit individuals who are spending a lot of their time in the gym working through their own traumas. but I'm just walking up my bike and about to head over. Truck rolls through, windows down, and I hear faggot screamed out. It was at me. So, what do? I look up, I see the guy, he's alone. I don't see a weapon. There's 200 very fit men behind me who, if I call it, if I yell, and it was a really weird moment because while at a different point in time in my life, that would have been a traumatic experience for me, living, being in a city, having queer community, having queer friends, it was something that would have been really triggering at another time in my life. But at that point in time in my life, I'm like, oh, okay, some bigot, I'm good, and you learn how to sort of walk away from it. Those are some, examples that people might think of. I still to this day, I love my boyfriend. He's a wonderful, wonderful man. Walking in our neighborhood, I am not comfortable holding hands with my boyfriend because it goes from us being just two guys walking down the street to feeling like, oh crap, is this simple act of affection going to invite some nonsense that I don't want to deal with while we're walking to get a coffee or whatnot? In the neighborhood, I feel differently about that. But living in South Philly, anybody who knows me knows that I'm gay. This is not a secret. Kiva always starts with, I'm the black guy. I'm the gay guy, that is who I am. There are ways, I think something that John had said earlier was how has this impacted, things like colleges, family, or jobs. It didn't change. I talked a little bit about the family stuff, and it didn't change what college I went to because I was already well on my way there when I had this figured out. But my first two jobs, I came out during the job interview. The first one was an AmeriCorps program. It was run by nuns, and they are some of the most dedicated, wonderful Christians that I've ever met. And the other one was to be a middle school teacher. And it was actually a priest that I knew who was interviewing me. I wasn't teaching religion because it was a federal grant. But the classes that I was teaching, it was in a Catholic school. And in both those situations, having the experiences where I was very involved in my church growing up. And then once I started coming out, I had peers. I was told during confession one time that this would be a path that would lead me to damnation. These sorts of things really broke down a community and a support system that I'd figured out and had sort of used to get through that period of time in my life that was a little difficult. And then fast forward to I'm out of college. Both in my first two job interviews, I came out because I knew it could be a problem. And frankly, I didn't want to get in the door and find out afterwards that it was. I don't know, as to, and neither of you have identified as such, but two presumably straight men, I don't know, have you ever come out about your sexuality during a job interview? Was that a safety concern that you had?
Wow.
No.
My biggest problem was not coming out as a liberal in a very conservative job.
But I think that is so important what you just said, because I never thought about it like that.
Yeah, me neither.
So we talked earlier about privilege and oppression. And so that statement that you just mentioned, Clinton, both me and John as heterosexual males, that's a privilege for us. Because I never had to feel compelled to talk about. Mine was always, was I a competent enough black? Mine was always race related. I had to always feel like it was an underlying unspoken thing that I felt that I had to answer to in terms of my ability and competency as a African American male. But it was never something that I had to explicitly talk. Just implicitly like explicitly like just come out and say it. It was more
Yeah.
like an implicit thing that I felt internally. Well, I'm going on this interview. I got to make sure I look sharp. I got a decent suit. My hair's cut. Those things I needed to like consciously be aware. But I never thought about what you just said, that, you know, I didn't have to go and, you know, say that. I didn't have to say, you know.
My
Well,
first teaching job, my colleagues who were married could talk about their wife, talk about their children. But if I was dating somebody, that was not appropriate. One of my interview questions was, how would you handle if a student asked, or I think it was, how would you handle it if a student cited the Bible to me about being gay? And I'm just like, okay, well, one, I'm a federal employee, so I'm not probably going to have a deep religious conversation with my students.
Right.
Yeah.
In that role, you know, but two, it's not really in that situation. I'm the teacher. My personal life is my personal life. So I walked through it, but that was a curveball that I got on that job interview. You know, what would you do in this situation?
Mhm.
And had to sort of, in a way, justify that I wasn't going to be a gay problem for them.
Oh, wow.
I had a
Wow.
situation where I recruited, this is probably around 20 years ago. I was back in my law firm, and I recruited a group of intellectual property lawyers, and honestly didn't know that one of them was gay, but he was openly, I mean, I found out from him or whatever, but I reconnected with him recently, and he told me a story about his early days in the law firm. He's now with another law firm, but this was a small, but it just hit me. It was our practice of our law firm when one of the law firm members, whether it was a man or a woman, had a child, they got flowers sent to them. A common thing, whether the child was born naturally or adopted. And he and his partner, they're still partners today, adopted a boy who's now a young man.
Yeah.
And he was totally ignored.
Yeah.
Just totally ignored. It didn't count.
Yeah.
Because it was open, you know, the whole rest of the management of the firm, whoever was in charge of that, ignored. And those, you know, what struck me about your story there, Clinton, was the courage that you need to build up. I mean, the fact that you analyzed it, you felt you needed to disclose that you were gay in a job interview setting, which we wouldn't have to do, took some courage, despite all of those other experiences you had and had to deal with getting to that point of that job interview in your life. I mean, so I don't think people think about that.
Yeah.
Thank you. And the first time it happened was difficult. And I managed to walk through it. But the nun that I came out to during a job interview, it may have actually been the reason that I got the job. So I mean, who knows? Like, I was walking.
Yeah,
in,
they are wonderful. They really are wonderful women.
I mean, I had a sister who threw a Dr. Seuss book at my head in the third grade, but by and large, the nuns are usually about the work.
What that's, you know,
especially the ones that are in service.
Yeah. So I would imagine, and so, you know, I'm part of the African American church community, right? And so again, here's another thing about privilege versus oppression. In most African American churches, there's this double burden of, you know, if you're African American male and you're gay, that typically is shunned upon in certain church community. And I know in the African American community, in not all churches. So, and again, I'm not speaking for all churches. I just know the churches that I have attended, it was kind of like that's not a, you know, using certain condemning scriptures in the Bible to kind of profess why this is not this is not what God wants for you. And so it's interesting to hear, you know, just the different, you know, from a nun versus maybe a pastor in the African American community, how those viewpoints are looked at as it relates to what we're talking about tonight. I think there is There's a book out by Kimmel and Ferber that I use in the course I teach at Rutgers. It is called Privilege. And in that book, they coined this term, the double burden effect. And basically what that means is when you look at race, when you look at any other the social identities, it's just that. Like, so for example, you have two males that profess as gay, but it's there's an even viewpoint on society until you add the race component. And
Yeah.
Clinton, you just helped to clarify that. You said as a white male, you are afforded certain privileges. As a white gay male, you're afforded certain privileges. But in the African American community, African American male there's a double burden effect on that particular person, African American and Latino males, because of their male and their sexuality. But the moment that you add race on top of that, the race component creates a double burden in society. Do you agree with that point?
Oh, absolutely. And I think whether or not I agree with it is a moot point. No, I think it is objectively true.
True, yeah. That's a good.
Some people may not be familiar with the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, but she is the activist and lawyer who I believe is credited with coining the term intersectionality.
Yes,
so just what Kiva was talking about, and you can look up her stuff. Look up Kimberly Crenshaw and intersectionality on YouTube, and you can get a good primer. But yeah, absolutely. The things that I face as a white cisgender gay male are going to be very different than somebody who is a person of color, genderqueer, queer sexuality. And I forget what the other demographic I was comparing, but of course those are going to be different things. Of course those are going to be are going to come, because really it's the intersecting, it's the overlapping, that doubling effect of bigotry. And whether it is, and there are different in my training, talking about oppression, a lot of people have thoughts and feelings about, what is oppression? What isn't oppression? It's a very charged word. But it breaks down oppression into 4 levels: interpersonal, institutional,
organizational,
ideological, and then the last one and the worst form is internalized. So, this is not every couple of years, there's some, notoriously homophobic politician, pastor, whatever, who is caught in a motel room with a young boy, Some of the most outspoken bigots are doing that, just like my high school, where, everybody's, using the word faggot and, trying to prove how straight they are. Some of the worst bigots are that way and are so energized that way because they are hiding. They don't know who they are. It's that internal stuff. But but yeah, no, it's absolutely true. So the things that and even a gay Black man versus a gay Mexican man face are going to be different because of the ways in which prejudice exists against Black versus and I'm using Black, but we know that not every person of color that we say is Black. But even under minorities within persons of color, you see how these effects can be greater than the sum of their parts. You see that also in a lot of Latino, Latinx communities, because the Roman Catholic Church is such a prevalent religious force and authority. You get a lot of, I have friends from Honduras who it was not an option to live there as a gay male. They had to get out, and they knew that from very early on. And the 2 friends that I'm thinking of were fortunate enough to do that. But we know there's a lot of issues with immigrating into this country. And so that is not something that's available for everybody.
it's our standard last question. What didn't we ask that we should have that you think is really important for this in this context of courageous conversations?
Yeah.
When it comes to learning, I am not a fan of shouldn't and couldn't, because learning is a process. We are all different learners. We're coming from different places. One caveat that I'm going to give is for people who are like, oh, this is really interesting. Don't immediately run out and start peppering your one gay friend with 30 million questions and expecting them to do this. I, as an individual, have opted into this work. I have opted into this specific conversation. But there have been years of therapy and work that have gone into it to make me be able to talk about this kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah, interesting.
Just be cognizant that, not everybody is in a place to do this. So asking people, hey, would you mind having a conversation? I'm feeling like I don't know anything about gay people, and I'd like to learn. I'm always going to encourage people. There's so many resources out there. And whether you are a parent looking for resources and understanding, there's great organizations like PFLAG, where you don't have to go to a meeting. You can just download some of the, the online materials that are going to give you a framework, give you language to start understanding what's going on with your child. There are things like the Trevor Project. If you have a LGBTQ plus youth in crisis, there's a lot of different hotlines, suicide lines, crisis prevention lines you can call. I like Trevor because I typically, any resource I give out, I usually do a test run on. And the two test runs we did with Trevor, just beginning to end, was phenomenal, and was the kind of resource that I would want for me as a kid, or for any queer youth out there. But yeah, is there a question you guys didn't ask? No, there's no right or wrong way to go about this work. You have to start from where you are. Learning is messy, and maybe you don't want to, make that mess with somebody who hasn't sort of signed up to do so. But you got to continue learning. It's not one community, it's not one answer. If you really want to be an ally, if you really want to support, you have to continue to learn and grow. I've been to a number of trainings and I've read a handful of books on racism and different context to it, theories behind it and whatnot. But until I am a Black person or a person of color who is directly experiencing racism, I'm never going to know what that is. So for me, it's sort of a lifelong goal to continue to, whether it's academic or, the conversations that you have with friends or peers or in appropriate professional settings, you just gotta go after and answer those questions. And that's part of the reason I agreed to be on this and love what you guys are doing. It's not about perfection. It's not about a lecture or a refined speech. Just working through, doing some learning together, and then sharing that with people.
Wow.
That's a good,
I think that's, yeah.
good way to wrap us.
Yes. Yeah, we learned a lot tonight. I really appreciate you adding your insight, your perspective, your lived experiences, Clinton, your knowledge around this, the research that, I know you're very thorough when it comes to subject matter in general. And so I think, I know our listeners and those who are watching got a lot out of tonight's courageous conversation. And so I want to just thank you for, being a willing participant in this journey, because it is a race. We're all running, and some of us are running, some of us are jogging, some of us are walking. But the whole idea is how much closer can we get to a harmonious and a peaceful society? It's just step by step, learning, vulnerability, opening yourself up to new ideas, and just embracing a difference. So I thank you, my friend. I appreciate you, my friend.
You're
very welcome. It's nice to see you, because with the pandemic, I think it's been 2 years since we've been face to face.
Yes. We got a lot of work to do. Some good things are coming down the pike, and we definitely will be in touch. So thank you so much, Clinton. We really appreciate you.
And
Absolutely.
thanks to our listeners, and we look forward to bringing another in our courageous conversations to all of you out there. Good night.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Good night.